I'm Connor McReynolds, and welcome to The Dinner Party. In each episode of this podcast, I ask a fantastic guest to describe their dream dinner party. I find out where they would host it, what they would cook, and who would be invited. This week, I'm thrilled to be joined by the brilliant Josh Berry. Josh is a master impressionist. He's a satirist and comedian who's featured on Dead Ringers and The Now Show on Radio 4, and he has his own brilliant show, Josh Berry's Fake News, on Union Jack FM, a show that was nominated recently as Best Comedy Podcast at the 2020 British Podcast Awards. I've been a huge fan of Josh's since I was lucky enough to gig with him at lovely Jericho Comedy very early on in his career, and it's been a real pleasure to see his stock rise so rapidly. I can't wait to hear all about his dream dinner party, so without further ado, here is the truly excellent Josh Berry. All right, Josh Berry, hello. Thank you so much for joining me on the dinner party.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Connor. Thank you for having me on.
How are you doing, buddy?
I'm very good, thank you, mate. Yeah, I'm all right.
Good.
It's lovely. Better for talking to you. I always feel like my life improves when I see you and hear you. Well, I can't see you, but I can hear you, and that's
indeed.
okay.
It's probably for the best. You can't see me. Lockdown isn't my best look.
That's the problem with Zoom, eh? I was just going to say that's the problem with Zoom, right? Like you have to be very presentable, whereas you can do vocals in your wearing whatever you like.
We can just imagine that we're both sat here in dinner jackets, looking very refined. I can pretend on audio that I've had a haircut in the last 7 months.
You haven't had a cut for 7 months?
No, I got a haircut in January, and I was at the point in March where I was like, I really need a haircut. And then the barbers closed, and I was like, oh, God. And I've sort of reached a point now where it got so long that when they reopened, I was like, I may as well just grow it out. Like, there are charities where you can kind of donate your hair for sort of wigs and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's really nice.
So I just sort of figured I've gone this far with it. I may as well just wait a little while longer, get it cut, and then some good will have come of it. And that way then my wife can't be mad every time she looks at my head. It's like, I'm doing this for other people.
It's either the grow out or the lockdown shave, isn't it? Just get rid of it all, and that either suits or really doesn't suit a human being. So yeah, we've seen the worst.
I definitely think if I shaved my head, I'd look uncomfortably like a pumpkin. So yeah, I definitely think growing the hair out has to be the thing.
A pumpkin, that's great.
How about you? How's your lockdown? Not just your hair been, but generally speaking.
Well, I've started to grow a beard, which is good. Well, it's sort of
fantastic.
The pubic hair that I was rocking all over my face is starting to fill in a bit, so that's nice. No, it's been all right, thank you, man. Yeah, it's a bit of a weird liminal, intermittent phase that we're going through now, isn't it? In that it's sort of broadly fine, but you don't have that absolute certainty, so it's a bit weird. But I just kind of was on social media for so much of lockdown, like a lot of people. Just churning out content, because in the absence of live stand-up, I've sort of become an influencer, which is a tragic reality that I spent so much of my stand-up career mocking influencers, and in an ironic twist, I've ended up becoming just like the very what's that phrase? Do you live long? Either you die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain, and the latter is evidently true in my case.
You've been putting out so much content, which is brilliant. And I mean,
not all of it's very good, but thank you. I love watch back,
but I just high engagement with it.
Yeah,
you get such engagement.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of grow from that. So I kind of just got to the stage where I was like, well, I'm not doing anything else, and I can't do anything else, so I might as well just really try and invest in this. And there's a lot of, I don't know how much TikTok you watch, but there's a lot of wank out there. Sorry, I am allowed to swear on this, am I? Is that?
Oh yeah, go for
There's a lot of wank on TikTok, and like comedy in inverted commas, and I just think it's for people like for hardened professionals like you and I, there's a real opportunity, I think, to say something funny, because what passes
Yeah.
comedy online is often so poor, I think.
Yeah, yeah, the idea that yeah, anybody thinks they can be. I think it's maybe broadly true, but I think there's a lot to learn about being funny before you're
Mm.
actually properly funny. Which
Mm.
kind of brings me on to something I want to talk to you about because we were chatting very briefly before we started recording. Uh, I was very lucky in that you and I gigged together a few times, kind of very early on in your career
Not many
before.
people say that. That's very lucky. That's so charming. This is why I love spending time with you, Connor. That's lovely.
Well, I mean, you had such an obvious talent. I mean, God, I wish I'd displayed a modicum of the talent that you had so early on in your career. But
That's very kind.
you, I mean, you are an impressionist. You have mastered so many of these brilliant voices, really recognizable voices. But to someone as kind of ignorant as I am as to what the art of kind of quality impressionist, being an impressionist
Mm.
involves, it's more than just the voice. You've got so much to craft and hone. There's the writing side of it as well.
Mm. Mm.
How much of a learning curve was it when from the point when you realized you could do these voices
Mm.
to where you are now? What have been the big lessons you've had to learn?
Yeah, I mean, it's that you're quite right. They're completely different skills. Being able to use your voice, and also being like like a sort of straight bread and butter, meat and potatoes impressionist. In that there's a difference between being an impressionist and being a comedy impressionist. I would
Hmm.
say in that like you can set out to directly replicate a voice with incredible accuracy, but obviously that's not funny. Like at best, that will impress an audience. It won't make them laugh, and obviously you're there to make them laugh. The thing I sort of found gradually overperforming. I was so obsessed with accuracy, but like I kind of got to the stage where I was like, well, who am I impressing here? Because no one in the audience has studied this person as much as I have. So I'm just doing it for my
Yeah,
own
yeah.
stupid standard. And I think as time's gone on, um, because there are types of impressions. There's like the really accurate one, like when I do someone like Andy Murray, it's supposed to be sort of really accurate. That's like my most accurate Andy Murray. Whereas if I was
Hmm.
doing him on stage, he'd have to sort of really like big up all the sort of time, and so. There's accurate impressions, there's comedy impressions, and there's even like Stuart Lee type impressions where he like takes it to the extent where it's deliberately bad, but it's like just a really disrespectful caricature, like oh, I'm Richard Hammond. Oh, look at me. I think this. And so like I think the Stuart Lee end of the spectrum is the funniest, to be perfectly honest. And as time goes on, I'm sort of probably moving a bit more away from like total accuracy and just disrespectful rudeness. But someone like Dara O'Brien's a good example. I think Dara O'Brien's like it's all very well doing his voice, but it's much funnier because I feel like an observation that works with Dara is that you kind of, I'm not sure that many people know what he's saying, and that he'll just sort of come on Mock the Week and be like, I'm over there, Mock the Week there, and I'm in there, the next round there, thank you very much. And that is so much funnier than going, and thank you very much for tuning into Mock the Week there, like, because it's taking that premise and sort of magnifying it. I guess that's what it's about. Sorry, I'm rambling on about this, but I guess that's what it's about. It's
No,
about
it's fascinating.
taking that micro element of someone and
Yeah.
caricaturing it, because you should view yourself as a caricaturist more than a parrot, I think.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's one of the I know very little about clowning as well. We could be here all day, me listing the things I know very little about, but I do know that with clowning, there's a principle of, take something and slightly exaggerate it, and then the next person slightly
Mm,
extends that exaggeration and brings it on that bit further.
mm,
And it sounds to me like you have to, as you were saying, get the essence and that level of accuracy before you can play with it and make it
Mm,
funnier.
mm, mm,
What's the? It may be different for kind of different people and different impressions, but the process, because I guess there's two ways I'm imagining you come from it. There's
mm,
some impressions that are like very useful to have, things that are in the zeitgeist,
mm,
people like Trump or Boris Johnson or
mm,
whatever,
mm,
which
mm,
I imagine maybe you kind of have to work quite hard to find. But
mm.
are there others where you hear their voice and you kind of think, oh yeah, that's definitely, I recognize that as being in my range, and it sort of comes quite easily? Or what's your sort of process, I guess?
Yeah,
It's a very
that's
vague question, I
no, no,
know, but
no, no. That's a really interesting. That is a really interesting question, and I guess it's like, yeah, for people like, well, to answer the sort of the first bit, for people like your sort of run of the mill impressions that kind of every impressionist needs to have to earn their salt, if you like. People
Mhm.
like Donald Trump, tremendous, bigly phenomenal, believe me, or Boris Johnson, yes, yeah. You have to be able to do them well, but at the same time, there's like an element of kudos I think you get in the sort of impressionist community uh, if you can be the first person to get someone. Do you know what I mean? Like, or the person that's
Yeah, yeah,
known for
yeah.
doing such and such. So if you can do that, then that's brilliant. But obviously, there's a trade off in that then they might not be as well known because it's unlikely if someone's really famous that some of the impressionists
Mhm.
won't do them. So yeah, and that's yeah, Alison McGowan and Roy Bremner. I've heard talk about that, about the problem with the fragmented nature of media now is such that you're trying to parody like people in the public consciousness, but the public consciousness is so diffuse that it's very
Mhm.
difficult to pick out a sort of set of unfailing people. Um, but yeah, I mean that's the difficulty, and I think arguably it might have been a little bit easier to do that in years gone by when there was less media options, right? And like
Mhm.
everyone would
Mhm.
have had more of a sense of who the famous people were, and that was it. But yeah, I think so. I think that's kind of how I would answer that. And then you asked me to what extent do I look at someone and think, oh, you should be in my wheelhouse, or you should be the sort of person that I'd be able to
Mhm.
get. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably do. I think yeah, I'm aware of my vocal range because I'm quite a young man, and I've got a sort of, I think, got sort of medium to high voice. I know that's true. It's not high. It's not low. It's kind of in the middle. And I'm aware that
Mhm.
like the very low voices I'll struggle with, like so Morgan Freeman or I don't know other people along those. I initially
I
sort of
I think Morgan Freeman is kind of the deep voice, yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. I'm trying to think of other people, or like I don't know
I
Liam
guess like
Neeson. Or
someone like Terry Wogan or something like that
yes,
has a
Terry
very
Wogan's a perfect
kind of honey
example.
voice.
Who, of course, I mean, John Coleshaw does so well. Steve Coogan does slightly less well on the trip, but John Coleshaw does him so well.
Peter Serafinowicz, I don't know if you know
Oh
his
yeah,
Wogan impression.
oh man,
It's absolutely outstanding.
dude, he is just. And then when Rob Brydon's doing his Ken Bruce as well, he's doing Ken Bruce, and and then all they need is I should have been on the other panel, doing Jeremy Vine, and I could have said, "Shut up, I want to talk." Um, but you see, that's the thing with Jeremy. He's a slightly higher voice, so it's easier to get for me. But you're yeah. But then there's the thing of you age, don't you? And your voice drops slightly as you age. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and so I guess it kind of in an interesting sense, you kind of travel with your impressions in a way, and you kind of follow. You sort of like a like sort of like a weird parodying guardian angel that follows these people through their lives as their voices get slowly deeper. So Tom Daly's God, he must be about 4 or 5 years older than me, and if that. And I started doing Tom when he was like 14. And I thought, yeah, wow, this is great. And Tom's voice will probably lower slightly throughout his life, but so will mine. So it'll kind of match up. But yeah, so sorry. So that's a consideration. I think I'm always thinking about like, are they too low? I have some accents that I feel very comfortable in, like Scottish. I find very easy to do. Like I didn't know that I could do Andrew Cotter until the other day, but I had a go at him and thought, what the commentator who does the sort of he did that viral clip, didn't he, with his dogs, and he's like Daisy there
so
having
funny.
a fine bite at the dog food, then Olive having another go, she's right behind her, that, and so that, but that's a very fortuitous outcome that would happen.
It's so interesting because I think pre-lockdown, like you were kind of saying, that lockdown's been an opportunity for people to get stuff online. Like, I don't think many people would say, "Oh yeah, Andrew Cotter, the sports commentator." But if you just mention his dog's names now, like Mabel and Daisy or whatever it is,
yeah.
immediately people will be like, "Oh yeah, that's that guy."
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
That's
Because
very funny.
that's the other interesting thing, that sort of there are voices out there. But like, if I do the impression right, that might strike a chord. You might be like, oh yeah, I've kind of heard him at the Olympics, or doing Wimbledon, even if you hadn't seen the video. And there's that interesting thing of like where someone's voice is kind of more famous than them, like the Headspace guy.
Yeah.
The one who's like, hi and welcome back to Headspace. Just try and relax, close the eyes, just gently feel the breath relaxing. And that's Andy Puddicombe who does that voice, but no one knows who Andy Puddicombe is. But if you go like, hi and welcome to Headspace, people know exactly who to do. Interestingly, he's quite similar to Stuart Lee. I always thought, in that Stuart Lee sort of, like that. Whereas Headspace man, a little bit more open, but still broadly the same. Yeah, Stu, we can tell you it is the same. Yeah, we all know you've been in the cheese stew. Yeah, we can see that, Stu. We can see that. Now just close your eyes and enjoy the cheese. Oh yeah, you like that, don't you? Yeah. Oh, I'm a young person. I like Headspace. Oh, look at me. Sorry, I don't know where I've gone to with that, but it's a weird one when you're trying to discover how to do someone. I kind of think if you spend enough time with a voice, if you spend enough time and you're like sit in a room, and you're just there and you've got to try and learn it, you'll eventually get something all right, unless it's totally out of your range. So I try to take quite an optimistic attitude to impressions, and just sort of have a go at it and see what I can do.
Do you ever find, like, when you're listening to something or watching something, I would imagine that there's a part of your brain that is like hardwired to analyze kind of vocal patterns, speech patterns, mannerisms, cadence, accents. Like, do you ever lose out on the actual content of what you're listening to because you're so busy analyzing the voice, or am I overthinking this?
Well, did you mean I'm paying attention to the vocal characteristics to the extent where I can't focus on the task at hand? Is that
Yeah, like if you're watching, for example, like if you're watching a kind of James Acaster show on Netflix, how much of you is appreciating the writing and his performance, and how much of you is like, oh yeah, he has a habit of saying like this sound like this, and he makes this noise a lot, and what's the sort of balance for you there?
Yeah, it's weird because I think in many ways I kind of don't vocalize it in my head. You just sort of, it like slots into my head, and I'm like, oh yeah, oh yeah. It's James oh yeah, but it's a weird one because you kind of don't vocalize what's going on. You just kind of like John Coleshaw calls this like downloading a character. So you've sort of just absorbed it, and you might so it's almost not conscious in a weird way. I'm sounding quite wanky when I'm talking. It's kind of like
this
a
is
subconscious
amazing.
process of insemination, but it kind of is a little bit. I don't know. I've got quite a flitty brain, Connor. That would be how I describe my mental state. I'm quite sort of like, I get bored of things quite fast. Almost like a sort of, I don't have ADHD, but it's that type of sort of, all over the place. Like Rory Bremner, quite like that. Who has ADHD. And so like, I'd probably go and watch him and hear him be like, fair play, and I'd sort of appreciate that, and it made me laugh extra hard because I'm like, he's doing my impression of him. But no, I went to watch James Acaster live, and he was absolutely flying. He was
Yeah,
really
well,
good.
he is someone. I mean, your impression of James Acaster got so much recognition and praise
Mm.
online to the point where he was engaging with your James Acaster content. Like, how surreal is that when someone who you're doing an impression of acknowledges your impression?
Yeah, I mean, particularly with James Acaster because I was so admiring of him. I kind of watched his specials like really early on when I just first started doing stand up, and I was just so kind of blown away by how you could create a narrative and then and sort of hang a comedy show off that, and I thought that was so clever. Um,
Hmm.
and it's so to hear, and I think the impression that I do is quite. It's clear. I think my admiration for him is clear in the impression, in that it's not like one of those. It's not like me going, "Oh, I'm James Acaster. Oh, look at his an apricot." It's but yeah, it's a sort of true rendering. Yeah, I mean, it was very surreal. It was an odd thing. I sort of go through periods where I kind of become quite obsessed with specific people, I suppose, and that makes it easier for me to do impressions of them. I went through that with Hugh Grant a while ago because I had this
Oh
bit
yeah.
where I was like, oh, in this one of the sort of more stand-uppy bits I do, I'm talking about kind of the type of posh that I am, and how
Hmm.
like I feel like there's like a sort of spectrum of poshness in that, like, as particularly as a young man, on one end there's sort of like the horrible made in Chelsea entitled, young man, like someone so entitled that he like sleep with his best mate's girlfriend and just be like, mate, collateral damage. She's not the first. She won't be the last. And then on the other end, there's like a sort of Hugh Grant in Full Weddings and a Funeral, very sort of like, gosh, shit, sorry, I apologise for breathing, fuck, excuse me, fancy that, shit, and how sort of I feel like I kind of fit in between those two
Yeah,
extremes.
yeah.
But yeah, because I thought, oh god, it would be so good if I could get Hugh Grant, because he's the the definition, particularly in that film, of sort of the bumbling young posh English person. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
sometimes you can kind of wish for an impression, learn it, and then it will fit into a routine.
That's so interesting. You mentioned earlier there, uh, John Culshaw, and
Mm.
obviously, since we first gigged together, only kind of a couple of years ago, your career's just kind of skyrocketed, and you've had all these really cool things like working on Radio 4 and the Now Show and on Dead Ringers.
Yeah,
Like,
very nice.
how surreal is it for you? Because I'm assuming growing up, you admired impressionists like John
Mm,
Ravens and John Culshaw, and then suddenly you're working alongside them.
mm. Yeah, it was a weird one. It was a yeah. I mean, because John's so, particularly John, because I think John was the one that I was most aware. Well, here it was him and Alistair McGowan were the two I was sort of most aware of, because I think when I was growing up, Rory Bremner sort of had his time, big time on the
Yeah,
TV, and it was the big impression of
yeah,
Alistair
yeah.
McGowan. That was like 2002, I think, so I was still a little bit young then. But particularly when the impression show with Culshaw and Stevenson was on in like sort of 2008, that was
Mhm.
huge, and that was a really sort of formative comedy show, along with like that Mitchell and Webb look and the Armstrong and Miller show and stuff, that really kind of was my comedy childhood, I guess. So yeah, it was, and John is just the loveliest bloke. Like, he's such a lovely, gentle, kind, encouraging, and phenomenally talented, man. And so
Yeah, yeah.
it was really cool. I was very nervous because I was like 22 when I did it, and it was super like big
Wow.
deal. Dead Ringers. This is this
Yeah,
it's the
yeah.
cream of doing impressions, and yeah, so I didn't enjoy the process as much as I would now, I think, because I was very sort of, green
That's
with the whole
interesting.
thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know John. I mean, they're all. It's really nice, actually. The people who do impressions, because it's quite a small. The number of people that are really good. It's like maybe about
Yeah.
20, 30 people, and it's a lovely community of people who are really supportive, and in a way that I don't know if this is your experience in a way that I haven't always found in comedy, which can be a little bit more snipey. I don't know if that's your
Yeah,
experience.
I think it can be a mixed bag. One thing that I've spoken about on our other podcast, the Jericho Comedy Podcast, talking to stand-ups, like different nights tend to take on the some of the characteristics of the people running them, and I think that's such an
That's
interesting thing.
interesting.
Something like Jacob Hawley talked about. So if someone is an absolute shit and they run a night, that it's probably going to have some of those characteristics of that person who is a shit about them.
Yeah,
But something like Jericho Comedy, where we've gigged together,
yeah,
run by Alex Farrow and Harry Howsam, who are just
yeah, yeah,
such
yeah.
lovely, kind people,
Mm,
and the audiences reflect that, and the
yeah,
acts who come
completely.
along recognize that it's such a lovely environment. So I feel quite fortunate in that, like, most of the gigs I do are with Jericho Comedy, which is
Mm,
such a warm, friendly, inclusive night. But I
yes.
have certainly been to nights where I'm just like, what did I do wrong, and why do all of these other acts hate me so much? Like,
Yeah,
it can be weird.
yeah. There's a lot of sort of posturing, isn't there? But you know, people. A friend of mine who's a stand-up. We talk about this about like where you try and kill the green room, and you're sat backstage and you're like cracking jokes left, right, and center because for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable in the space, and it's just a bit uncomfortable, I think, and it's. But I suppose that's the thing when I'm not saying that everyone who does comedy is a narcissist, but there's a high rate of narcissism in comedy, definitely.
Sure.
And
Yeah, yeah.
when you see someone else doing well, I don't think a narcissist would respond. They wouldn't be like, "Oh well, they deserve it." They'd be like, "Well, why am I getting the praise?" Do you know what I mean? So I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
probably
yeah.
the. I guess that's probably the
The kind of
explanation for
comedian who
it.
comes off stage and says, "Oh, the MC didn't warm them up enough
Yeah,
for me."
yeah.
It's like, well,
And don't get me wrong. There are definitely reasons why things may or may not work. But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But sometimes the reason is you.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is true. I think it's important that we all acknowledge that.
But it's nice, I think, for a self-preservation thing for us to have those excuses we can fall back on. Certainly, once or
Well,
twice I've come off stage bemoaning what had happened
yeah,
before
yeah,
me on
yeah,
stage, and
yeah.
like, well, I never stood a chance.
But
But
it's
yeah, I
also
think looking
sometimes
back, it was me.
locational, isn't it? Right, you can kill it in Guildford to light titters from a room,
Yeah,
whereas
it's
in the north it
it's one
tends
of the
to be nicer.
mysteries of comedy that if the writing doesn't change and if the way you perform it doesn't change,
Mm,
how can it be so massively differently received
mm.
in one room to another? It is kind of it's a mystery that I think nobody will ever fully solve. Like if it was a formula, some comedian would have cracked it by now and sold it for millions,
But that's
and we
it's
would kill it every gig.
yeah, well, yeah, but there are. I don't know if you found this. I've definitely found there are interesting differences between like the north and the south. In the north, they're really up for a bit of. They're much more up for a bit of banter. They're up for a bit of like back and forth. And normally the stuff that they heckle, as Stuart Lee said this as well, and I heard him say this. The stuff they heckle is normally
Hmm.
really funny. Uh, so
Yeah,
normally the
yeah,
gigs I've done there, you have to sort of play it a bit lower status because they're really funny people, and so you have
yeah,
to kind of be like you have to play the fool a bit more there. Whereas I feel like if I'm gigging in like London or something, where it's more like liberal elite artsy wankers, you kind of I think playing it a bit higher status and a bit more arrogant, which I think they respect inherently a bit more than
yeah.
in the north because particularly sounding and looking like I do, which is posh disgrace. If I perform in the north and I do that, they're like, "Oh, who's this bellend?" Whereas in the south, it's just that. Well, I mean, to be honest, most of the people that come to my gigs are just people from better private schools than the one I went to. So
Right,
I kind of
right.
have to play up the poshness in order that they accept me, to get acceptance that I don't even want from people that I actually despise, which is a really odd phenomenon.
That's really interesting. That's really, really funny. Josh, I want to talk to you about so many different things, but we're about half an hour in.
Oh yeah,
and I
we've got to
haven't
talk
asked
about
you
the
a single thing
guest.
about your dream dinner party.
Yeah.
So, before we get into the specifics about kind of where it would be, who would be there, what you'd
Yeah.
be cooking, uh, first of all, just to kind of get a general sense of what the tone of the evening would be,
Ah,
like, what are
okay.
you hoping your guests would kind of go away saying, like, oh, there was some really interesting conversation tonight, or like,
Yeah.
it was just a really good laugh? What's the sort of vibe that you want to strike?
Wow, that's how egotistical of me when you said what you're hoping for, that I immediately shot to, well, I hope I have a really good time, right? And then you were like, no, but what about your guests? And I was like, no, yeah, it's about me, isn't it? Um,
I think that's legitimate. I think if it's your dream dinner party,
yeah, yeah,
it would
okay,
be a
yeah,
shame if you went away from it saying, that could have been better. That's not a dream.
yeah. I think, what would I like the vibe to be? I would really like it to be. You know when you're in the presence of someone who is like just phenomenally gifted at telling entertaining stories, and did you know
Yes.
what I mean? Like my girlfriend's dad is like that. He has a real gift for storytelling, and I feel like you either have that or you don't. And some people, yeah, so I would love that sort of atmosphere, but also an atmosphere where, and this is another thing that insecure comedians maybe like to see a little bit more, is like the sort of one up at the end of a story. So someone's told a brilliant, you know, uh, amazing story. It's brilliant, so funny, and then someone comes in at the end as like, "Ooh, here's a shit joke to add to it because I don't feel happy with the fact that you told a really good story." Not that, just the opposite of that, because that I despise that. So just a really nice sort of supportive, interesting place, and also probably the opportunities to hear some sort of or to just see a bit of vulnerability from the people at the table. I quite enjoy that. I enjoy
Ah,
getting to know the sort of depths of people, and I would like that to be the case as well, or as well
that's
as sort of some nice
very
food. And yeah,
interesting.
but that's kind of that would be the tone.
That is very, very interesting. And knowing who you're inviting, I'm particularly intrigued by that last thing you just said. Well, before we get on to who is going to be there, let's chat about where it would be. If you could host your dinner
Yeah,
party anywhere in the world, what's the
yeah.
place that you think would be best to bring together this group of people?
I quite like I like feeling at home, and I think I feel very at home around the Thames, and that's probably the most poshest, the most poshest, the poshest thing I've ever said in my life. Absolutely, which I undermined with the awful semantics of saying the most poshest. Uh, but yeah, I think probably around there. I just love the water. It makes me feel very.
Yeah.
I sound like such a little, young white
No,
influencer
no, I'm 100% with you. I
it
love it
really
as
like
well.
centers me spiritually, and I just feel really like myself doing it on there, and it's really good. Like I love it. But no, it's true. I would like to do it. I think probably like on the bank, or maybe in the river on a boat. I don't know, but certainly
Oh,
around
yeah.
there. But yeah, because I just think in a sort of nice summer day, ideally no horrible mosquitoes and all that crap. Yeah, I mean, I probably around the Thames. I think because I like feeling at
Fantastic.
home. I think if it was a dinner party that I was organising it, I'd like to feel as though I was organising it in my home and people were coming to a sort of area that I called home. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, that sounds brilliant. All right, so we're by the Thames, and your first guest is someone who you do a fantastic impression of, and I think this might be a bit of a running theme over the course of the evening. This person is someone who might be a bit of a daring choice. You're inviting culinary bastard Gordon
yes,
Ramsay.
no bastard.
I
That could
really.
be his official title. I think that's what
I think
culinary.
if anybody has earned the moniker, it's definitely Gordon Ramsay. I
Yeah.
was surprised by this choice because
Oh, well, you interesting.
he is a bit of a dick. Like,
Yes.
but
Yes.
what positive qualities do you think he would be bringing to your dinner party?
So I watched a friend of mine who produces the stuff I do on Union Jack Radio.
Yeah.
Giles Gear sent me an early documentary of Gordon Ramsay in the 90s, and at this point, he's got his Gordon Ramsay restaurant, or restaurant as he calls it, And he's got 2 Michelin stars, and he's waiting for his 3rd one. And you just sort of get to know him a little bit. And yes, he's an absolute bastard to all of these poor chefs, and the amount of abuse, like, over just such minor things. It's like, hey, big boy, that lettuce is fucking burnt, so take it, put it in the bin, and fuck off. And you can take a, £20,000 pay cut as well, you prick. You can pay me to be here, so fuck you. All right, now fuck off. But I think, like, in that, yes, he's very abusive, but he kind of does it in a caring way. And I know that sounds so counterintuitive, but you get to see through all the chefs how, in something where you have to be so clinical, kind of, or it's like surgery. It feels like you have to hammer people for any minor mistakes. And I do think you actually thank those people down the line. Like at university, one of my harshest tutors, who made my friend cry because she was such a sort of task mistress. But I thank her enormously for that, because it improved my intellect dramatically. And it's like that. Have you ever seen the film Whiplash?
Yes.
So,
J.K. Simmons.
like the Terence Fletcher phenomenon.
That's interesting.
And he's like, there's no word more harmful than it, no phrase more harmful in the English language than good job. And like, I don't believe that entirely, but I think there's something to that in disciplines where you have to be a technician. So I think he's a good mentor. I also think he's very funny. So I think he would have some very interesting stories. And I would also be hoping that, because what I've been doing, I've just kind of been cooking all of his recipes in lockdown, which I really enjoyed.
Wow.
And I was hoping sort of I'd make his recipes and either do them well, in which case he'd be impressed and he'd be like, wow, big boy, fucking delicious, well done. Or I'd do them so badly, he'd be like, wow, fuck me, this is not good. I'm going to the kitchen, you sit down. So I could talk to my guests a little bit more. So I've kind of, it's a win-win. It's a win-win.
You've got your bases covered there. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I would imagine he'd be quite terrifying to do your impression too. You've had this experience a few times where you've done the impression of that person to their face.
Yeah.
How do you think Gordon Ramsay would take it?
I don't know. I think he'd sort of come back with some sort of, oh, fuck off, you donkey. I don't sound like that. I don't think he'd like it. I think he'd sort of, he'd get it. But it's a bit of a weird one. I don't know if you've ever had anyone do an impression of you. I've had people do it to me. And I think it's hilarious. Like, I think it's really funny.
I mean, being Irish over in England, obviously you get everyone saying the word potato in what they think is an Irish accent, but actually it sounds more Jamaican.
Yeah. Well, they should be cancelled for that.
No one's ever. Awful. I would imagine it would be the worst waste of anybody's time ever to try to do an impression of me.
That's a horrible thing to say. No, not at all. That must be a. That must be
something that you get a lot as an impressionist. People coming up and saying, "Oh yeah, I do a really good," and then doing their impressions for you.
That's interesting. No, they tend to ask me to do them, which is why I sort of stopped saying I'm an impressionist. I mean, I don't. Yeah, I kind of more would consider myself to be a comedian now, I guess. So I would say I'm a comedian, and then they'd be like, "Oh, tell me a joke," and I'm like, not for free. I'm not doing that. Like,
exactly. You never say to a surgeon, "Oh, go on then, take my gallbladder."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the weird thing about that, I always find, is it's like that in no possible scenario can you succeed, right? Because they've set the bar. They're like, come on, impress me. And I feel like so much of comedy works in that it's about defying your expectations. So managing to convince an audience that it's going to be shit, and then it turns out okay. And that's brilliant. Whereas they're expecting brilliance, and I'm just trying out the same mediocre shit, and that's going to look even shitter than shit by comparison, given his expectations. So, I just no. So I don't actually have that. I haven't actually had anyone do impressions to me, which is odd. Yeah, but I guess I don't know how many. I guess everyone has one impression, don't they? Everyone can do someone, right?
Yeah. Sometimes they're like very obscure. Like the only ones I can think off the top of my head I can do are Scooby Doo,
Yeah,
Elmo,
yeah.
and maybe a passable Cher, depending on the
Oh, share.
day.
Okay, that's nice. Yeah, yeah. I like that.
But yeah, I don't know how I discovered I could do Scooby Doo when I was younger, but I won't do it now. But back to Gordon Ramsay. He's at your dinner party.
Yeah.
You certainly sound, you've made the case for him being a very interesting person. I can't
Mm.
deny he does sound absolutely fascinating. What would you want to talk to him about? Like, he's there, you can pick his brain.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk to him about his food? Do you want to talk to him about kind of his lifestyle? What would you want to ask him?
Yeah, I mean, he's. I think one of the fascinating. Well, there are a couple of fascinating things about him. He's come from sort of very modest, humble beginnings, and has made such a phenomenal success of himself.
Hmm.
I just I love being around really driven, motivated people because I find it really inspiring. And I think often in comedy we like to sort of glamorize not working hard. There's that thing of, I think particularly among the British comedians, less so in America where they're all like, "Oh, dude, I'm fucking crushing it, bro. Oh, look at me, I'm so fucking high status, man." Whereas like in the UK, I think we're a bit more sort of like, it's cool to be shit and not to work hard, and that's not really an attitude that I kind of buy into, or at least that's an attitude that people like to present. I don't know whether it's necessarily what they have under
Yeah,
the
yeah.
surface, but yeah, no, I like being around sort of really motivated people, and he's been very successful in. Well, he nearly became like a footballer for I believe Glasgow Rangers, and he messed up his leg when he was like
Yeah,
19.
that's right.
And it's just
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I just love that mentality. I love the sort of just the hunger for success, and I think I just find it very inspirational. So yeah, probably less about the sort of the nuts and bolts of the food, and more just his hilarious stories, which I imagine of which I imagine he has many. I love a bit of celebrity gossip, and just his sort of general attitude, because I think that's one of the coolest things. When you're around like unbelievably successful people, yeah, you just learn a lot. So I think, yeah, it would be an opportunity to learn if nothing else.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a really interesting choice. And what a great first guest to kick off your dinner party. Kind of on the calmness scale, I would say that your second guest is very firmly on the opposite end of the spectrum to Gordon Ramsay. You're inviting the ever so charming Louis Theroux.
Yeah,
Louis is
is
someone
that a
whose
little
voice
bit?
you've also.
Is that a bit weird doing that? Would you feel a bit weird if I sort of, if Louis sort of came along? Would he sort of sit at the table talking to people? Would he do that? Yeah, that's a little bit weird, isn't it? Is it weird? That's he doesn't do that so much, but like we were talking about earlier, it's like taking that like small aspect and like bringing it out. But he does.
Yeah,
He sort of,
yeah.
because Louis sort of got that quite soft voice that he does, a little bit like that. And there's a real sort of he's enunciating things very clearly, and then sometimes sort of goes into that lower bit and then goes into the high bit again, like but sort of like, "How do you do? I'm Louis from the BBC." And then yeah, do you know what I mean? So there's the soft bit, there's a soft enunciated bit, and there's the sort of "hello, good to see you" bit as well. So you're kind of playing off each other. Yeah, Louis Theroux, what an interesting dude. I think he's fascinating. I think rather like Gordon Ramsay, he's seen a lot, and I think he would have some
Yeah.
phenomenal stories to tell. I don't know if you've seen him on Ruhalistapa, Richard Herring the Square podcast, where
Oh no, I haven't.
he's really good on that, and he's very funny. He's a really funny man, actually, and his act outs. He does loads of like impressions, he act outs when he's talking, and I just think
Oh wow.
that's a great. Obviously that's the sort of what the key. That I feel like that's one thing I've definitely learned a lot in the last year. I mean, well, 6 months
Yeah.
when I was doing stand up. Obviously, 6 months I haven't really, but it's just the importance of act out, and particularly for my act when so much of it's based on characters and voices and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
fascinating guy. I love his documentaries. I love his. He's again very successful man in his own way. He has a real niche that he's carved out. He's got a very clever style of questioning, a sort of like almost like Socratic way of interviewing,
Yep.
in that like he's sort of leading the breadcrumb trail to get someone to open up about themselves,
Yeah,
which I think is
yeah,
really clever. And yeah, so I think he would be very entertaining and just an interesting kind of guy. And he's a bit more sort of from my kind of background, so it would be interesting to sort of have a bit of common ground in that sense as well.
yeah,
Yeah, I sort of
yeah.
think it would be
He's a
great.
fascinating guy. He's talked recently because he's got this upcoming BBC series. He's sort
Mm,
of looking back at 25 years of his documentary making, and
great.
he's kind of reflecting on it. And he says that he's worried that maybe sometimes he's gone a bit too far in some of his interviews.
That's
He
interesting.
said something really interesting. He said he had a tendency to be glib, to disarm with the aim of making light of people's deeply held beliefs, to act the
Yeah,
clown and to make fun. But he does
that's
it in a very winning
interesting.
way. I think if someone else said that, I would think, yeah, they sound like they're maybe being a bit disrespectful toward people, being a bit of a dick. But I don't think he ever goes so far as to be disrespectful. It's quite a fine line he walks, I
Mm,
think.
mm. But that's for me that's the joy of watching Louis Theroux. There's so much rich subtlety in everything he does, right? And
Yeah.
and I think I think we would all of us would be wrong if we were to look back on past work and say this is totally faultless and there's no issues with any of this, right? Like
Yeah. yeah.
uh, I think it's important to be able to have that. But I think at the same time, he seems so reflective and considered that what he is criticizing himself of is incredibly subtle. But the thing I would add to that is like no one's watching the Westboro Baptist Church and looking at that and going, "Oh yeah, these
Show
guys
these
are
people
reasonable."
respect.
You know, I think loads of people are looking at that thinking, "Oh fucking hell, Louis, you're not going far enough." Which
Yeah.
isn't true either, right? Like I actually think he strikes a really good balance. But yeah, I mean, I imagine he's referring to his earlier documentaries where, and I watched some of these with my girlfriend the other day, and they are they're much more naughty. He's much more like, he loves doing, when you ask someone, yeah, like the Socratic question is what we call it in
hmm
like philosophy, where, uh, let's say someone's smoking and they're worried about their health and you want to stop them smoking. So you're like, I'll do it as Louis Theroux. Do you think that smoking is a good thing to do for your health? Do you know what I mean? Like the implication being, oh, you can draw up the dots. Smoking's not good for your health. You should stop. And he
yeah,
definitely does
yeah.
a lot of that to kind of like undermine people's beliefs. But I don't think that's necessarily being glib. I think to a certain extent that's kind of just encouraging people to have self awareness and reconsider arguments around the beliefs they hold. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I really admire him as a documentarian. I mean, I think
Mm.
in the truest sense of the term, he really does like, document things and he gives people their fair say.
Mm.
His response, while the words themselves might be quite balanced, the looks that he gives, they are maybe a little bit kind of editorializing. He sort of you see
Yeah.
a lot of what he thinks in the little looks he gives, but I think he's pretty balanced guy.
Yeah.
What if there was one piece of his work that you really admired? You mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church there,
Yeah.
and that was the first Louis Theroux documentary that I remember watching and
Yeah.
thinking, "This guy's incredible."
Mm.
But like, what other? Because I'm assuming to perfect your impression, as you so obviously have done, you've had to watch a lot of Louis Theroux.
Mm.
What other kind of pieces of his work have you really admired? Is
Well, I
there
mean,
one in
I've kind of
particular?
watched them all, to be honest. I say kind of. I've watched them all. I've watched them all multiple times. I really enjoy them. I mean, I think he's at his best when he's doing the sort of weird and wacky ones. And there's a bit when he's at
Yeah,
the
yeah.
brothel and she's like, okay, does someone want a blowjob now? And he just like looks at the camera and he looks so, so awkward. Oh my god, one of the best bits of that episode is when he's answering the phone and he's like, "Hello, welcome to the Wild Women Brothel, where wild women will. Louis speaking. How may I help you today?" And it's just like it's how he gets stuck in, and he's clearly so aware of his own awkward, very sort of posh English thing, and and like and sort of leans into that awkwardness. I think is really amusing and enjoyable. I recently watched the polyamory one, which I really like. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh, I've heard about it, but I've not watched it yet.
It's just
I think it's
about.
too early on in my marriage to suggest watching that with my wife.
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like that's you've got to mention that on the first date, or it's just never going to happen.
Yeah,
You got
certainly.
to lead with, "Sorry, this is a deal breaker for me. Are we go or not?" But I think, yeah. Well, but it was actually, I think everyone. There's probably certain parts of people's heads where they think, "Oh, yeah, that'd be really cool to like have my emotional security, and then have this." I mean, maybe people don't think that, but I think probably some young men, in
Hmm.
principle at least, would probably think that. But the
Yeah,
reality is, you just lose out on the emotional security. It felt like to me, and there was one instance. It was just so sad. This guy was just desperately in love with his wife, and she was sort of having this relationship. It was just like an affair, basically. It wasn't an affair because he just sort of let her do it because he was so desperately in love with her.
yeah,
But like, he got to the end of the documentary, and he was like, "Yeah, I would, when you this his wife and this other guy, when you guys like have sex, like I'd like to be there. Like, would that be okay?" And she was like, "No, I'm afraid that won't be happening." And you just see his heart break, and you just see this, and it's
oh
just,
no,
it was really sad. But I thought that was lovely in that it had the sort of awkward through around sex thing at the same time as the the human side and a real vulnerability you don't always
yeah.
necessarily see with Luther.
He's such an interesting guy.
Mm.
I mean, would you be hoping that he would just have all these brilliant stories,
Yeah,
or are there aspects of like his kind of personal politics that you know about, or anything that you would want to question him about, or yeah, what would you be
yeah.
hoping the kind of Louis Theroux experience would be?
Well, I think I think firstly, probably this maybe is a bit narcissistic to say, but there'd almost certainly be an element of flattery at the fact that Louis Theroux would know who I was and ask me questions, maybe a bit like in his documentaries. Uh, but I think, from what I see, certainly in the early stuff, is that he's very cheeky with a mischievous sense of humor, which I think I would enjoy. Uh,
Uh-huh.
and I think, yeah, I would be really interested to see what he thinks about things, because often that's what's left missing from. uh, I think a
Yes,
lot of these people that I've chosen, not all of them, but there's a sense of mystery around them, and that's kind of why I've chosen them, because I think there's just sort of more I'd like to find out. But he's also really, obviously a very intelligent man with I imagine some very interesting perspectives on a wide variety of issues. So I'd love to sort of get to
definitely.
talk to
Yeah.
him about things like
He's
that.
such a great choice. I always like to see what's the kind of common thread
Hmm.
that kind of connects everybody's guests. And you touched on it there, and you've kind of scratched that itch at the back of my brain, because you're right. Everybody there is that kind of sense of mystery about them. And I think
Hmm.
maybe nobody more so than your next guest, because
Hmm.
he is someone who disappears, completely disappears into character, becomes unrecognizable from his actual self, to
Hmm.
the point where I kind of think this person can relatively comfortably walk down the street and not be recognized, because he is so well known
Hmm.
as other people. You're inviting Sacha Baron Cohen
Hmm.
to your dinner party.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Such a brilliant choice. When did you first become a Sacha Baron Cohen fan?
I think probably. I mean, obviously, I watched Borat because I was like, yeah. So when did that come out? Like 2006. I remember watching that in like maybe 2007. So I was like
Yeah,
11
yeah.
at that point. So I mean, that was, yeah, awesome, and just so funny. And you don't really understand it at that age, do you? Because you're like, you don't realize what he's doing, which is obviously
Yeah,
so
it definitely
brilliant.
works on levels.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just appropriating it entirely at face value and laughing because he's saying my wife is dead, and you're like, okay, that's not the point. But I mean, I get it. The thing is, like, those are jokes that you're allowed to make because they're ironic and satirical, but they're also good
Yeah.
jokes, right? Like, they are like structurally speaking, they're good jokes. And obviously, if
Yeah.
you deliver them like Jim Davidson does, at face value. That's unfortunate and makes them not so good. But yeah, that's the genius of the satirist, I think. Um, but yes, to respond to when I've kind of really become a fan in the last year. Well, I mean, I guess I would. This sounds unbelievably up my own arse, but I would consider myself to be kind of primarily a satirist now, who sort of
Yeah.
does voices, but a lot of what I do is political satire, and so I think I just have such a, and certainly like in years to come, I would rather be perceived to be more of a sort of Steve Coogan type figure, or someone like that, than a Alison McGowan or a John Coltrane. As brilliant as those guys are, I just love
Yeah. Yeah.
satire. I think it's so interesting, and I just have such an admiration for everyone in that sort of group. By which I mean, Iannucci, Morris, Stewart Lee up to a point, definitely. I mean, I think he's so brilliant. I didn't invite him because I think he's a
Hmm.
bit retiring, apparently, in person, which is good, even though he's so funny.
Oh,
But I
that's
would have done.
interesting.
Morris, Baron Cohen, Charlie Brooker, all those people. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that's probably the reason why I've become such a fan recently, and particularly because kind of what I'm doing more now is quite closely allied to that. So I think I probably view him as something of a mentor in that sense, and I could learn a lot because, like, a lot of what I'm doing is using characters to either take the piss out of people or try and say interesting but obviously funny things about British
Yeah.
society and the British
Yeah.
establishment. So yeah, I would just value every second of his time because I think he's a genius, and I think he came up with a new type of satire in that that kind of like Theroux, and that's an interesting thing in that obviously Louis Theroux's not satirizing anyone, but he's hanging the noose is a bit unfair, but he's certainly giving someone a microphone and letting them explain themselves. And that's precisely what Sacha Baron Cohen does. He's saying, look, here's the flaw. I'm going to say a load of stuff that's,
Hmm.
homophobic or anti-Semitic or sexist. And if
Hmm.
you agree
Hmm.
with it, then I've shown, bigotry that exists in British society. And I think that's well, it seems revolutionary to me at least. Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and it is just such a unique and innovative thing, and that's been his thing for his pretty much his whole career, and because it's such a fruitful premise, he's built films out of that and
Yeah.
TV series.
I mean, it's so difficult to underestimate the level of skill involved with what he does because
Mm,
not only does he write great stuff for these characters and in acting skills,
mm,
he becomes someone else entirely,
mm,
but also, as you say, like this is so much of what he does is improvised. That he's
mm,
improvising with and responding to real people,
mm,
and as you say, laying the carefully worded traps that allow people to expose their own prejudice and bigotry.
mm.
And all of that is happening in a microsecond where he makes a decision to
Yeah,
say
yeah.
something, and it's second nature and instinctual.
Mm,
He's really extraordinary, and he's someone. I read one of the things you wrote for Chortle last year,
mm,
and I was really interested in it. You said in that in relation to Bo Burnham that
mm,
he kind of showed you that satire shouldn't be reserved for just politicians.
mm.
And is Sacha Baron Cohen someone that you think kind of exemplifies that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do have this perception of satire very often that it's this entirely Oxbridge Radio 4 political domain that only exists for people who are sort of in their 50s to feed out to an audience of agreeing Radio 4 listeners. And satire ought not to just be that. I think it's so much broader, and it can be anything from the sort of grotesque, barbed caricature of Spitting Image, which is its own type, which is very interesting,
Hmm.
to the sort
Hmm.
of very subtle, clever Sacha Baron Cohen stuff. But yeah, I don't think it ought to be reserved for politicians. I mean, in I have to be a little bit careful saying this because a lot of what I do is this, but I think sometimes we do give politicians quite a hard time. Uh, and I mean, I don't get me wrong, I've really enjoyed doing that over lockdown, but we did, yeah. I think there's so much to satirize. Steve Coogan's got that film about called Greed that is supposed to. I don't know whether it's come out yet, but it's
Oh yes, this is the one about like the fashion industry, is
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's a fascinating area to have a go. But
Yeah.
I also think it's the really fascinating question here as well is like, what's your starting point? So like for a lot of Radio 4 satire, the starting point is let's satirize specific like current events and politicians doing current things, right? So like Boris Johnson or whoever. Whereas for
Hmm.
Sacha
Hmm.
Baron Cohen, it almost feels as though he's like the starting point is like let's just satirize um, British culture by coming at it from the outside as someone who would know nothing about British culture
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
exemplifies all of the worst instincts and impulses of certain people and certain attitudes in the British culture. So he's doing it in a way that I think is just so much cleverer.
It's fascinating. I love hearing it, and you're right. When you go after attitudes, you're able to uh, poke fun at such a wider group of people.
Mm,
I mean, you do, as you've said, you've done some great political satire stuff. You know, you do the calls to Blojo, and they're great fun. That really makes fun of him and quite a select group of people.
mm,
But there is a way of doing satire as well, and again, something you do by kind of making fun of attitudes of certain types of
mm,
people that pokes fun at a wider set of people, and that's certainly something that I think Sacha Baron Cohen
mm,
does so well. He also plays with the line that's a very careful line to tread, and it would
mm.
be in unskilled hands very easy to step over it and just be plain offensive.
Yes,
But
agreed.
he balances that between being offensive and just punching up in just the right way.
Yeah,
Is that something that you've
absolutely.
learned from?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's but it's always that phenomenon, isn't it? With when you're trying to talk satirically about to what extent am I going to use words that were they not used in this context would be offensive and damaging, right, to people.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
like using homophobic slurs, for example, or something like that. Is it legitimate to use those because, or his like so Alan Partridge has that whole thing, didn't he, about the use of the word chav in Scissored Isle.
Mhm.
He did the
Mhm.
whole thing about that, and obviously like that seems I think it's actually a really horrible word to use because it's
Yeah.
really like
Yeah,
obviously
yeah.
derogatory, but it's perceived at least to be innocuous enough for him to get away with saying that. But were someone like I don't know Eamon Holmes or Richard Madeley, who arguably his character is based on, said it, then obviously
Yeah.
that would be awful. But yeah, I think it is a really important line to tread, but I think the issue with a lot of arguably, I was having a conversation about this with my friend the other day. I think a lot of the way that a lot of the people on the left perceive offensive language is that they, and this is a reasonable argument. Their argument is that use of the language, if it's oppressive, reinforces an oppressive reality in the world, right? So, like I'd
Mhm.
say an offensive homophobic slur, it reimposes homophobia. And the right seem to be saying, this might be unfair, but in my perception, the right seem to be saying, well, hang on a second, these are just words. Words don't really mean anything. It doesn't correspond to anything. And I think the truth is
Mhm.
probably, my personal opinion is not entirely as I characterize the left wing perspective, but mostly on that side. So because I'd add that caveat, mostly on that side, I think you should be allowed to get away sometimes with using certain types of words if you've created a framework whereby you're saying, look, I'm not endorsing this. I'm inviting you to consider whether or not it's right that I would choose to say these words. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. It's such an interesting area, and as you said, we could talk about it all day, but we're speaking about satire, we're speaking about really great satire, and your fourth guest is simply one of the best satirists
Mm,
that Britain's ever produced.
mm,
Again, he's someone that plays with that line between safe and provocative.
mm,
You're inviting Chris Morris
mm,
to your dinner party.
mm.
He's phenomenal. When did you become a Chris Morris fan?
Yeah, again, a sort of similar time. I mean, I was sort of aware of the day to day when I first started doing Josh Berry's fake news on Union Jack, which is sort of just finishing the third series, and that's coming out quite soon in like mid September.
Awesome.
Um,
Great.
But it's like when I first started doing that, I was sort of like, wow, this is great. Not fully maybe appreciating what it was about, in that like it feels like it was about, you know, at a first glance, it's like, oh, he's just saying nonsense statements, right? Like to
Yeah.
take the piss out of how seriously the news takes itself. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess it depends to what extent you like how you interpret what Chris Morris does. Because I've heard people talk about him, and he clearly. What I really like about him is his like he doesn't really have like a distinction between like high comedy and low comedy, if you like. So he'll
Yeah.
do something so
Yeah. Yeah.
silly and ridiculous. But it's such a funny bit in the Day to Day where he's interviewing someone, and he's like, "And what do you think about churches?" And then he said, and then like they've used like a thing to modify his speech, and he's like, "So what do you think about churches? Churches, churches." Like, and then he gets the guy to talk, and I just think like that is so silly and wonderful, but at the same time, he's saying something really interesting about like the moral panic of journalism at the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and how sort of seriously journalists take themselves. And I think what's really interesting about that is that in that my show is sort of, I think journalism's moved on in quite an interesting way since the 90s when he was doing that. And like journalism then was so like serious and full of like fear of drugs and pedophiles and all that kind of stuff. And now it's
Yeah. Yeah.
almost there's quite a lot of what I would call like emotional porn in the news now. Do you know what like?
Yeah.
Like in that, it's like, oh, isn't it? Oh, poor this person. Da, da, da. And don't get me wrong, life is hard. There are awful things that happen to people all the time. But there's a sort of a cynical sense I get when I look at that, because it's like, well, you're serving to profit off other people's tragedy, right? There seems a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of moral righteousness among quite a few journalists, I think, and this obsession with like how scrutiny is so beneficial, when actually a lot of the scrutiny at play isn't necessarily scrutinizing politicians in relevant ways. It's more just point scoring because they don't like the person quite at hand. Arguably, like Dominic Cummings. I mean, Dominic Cummings is no friend of anyone in the media, and the media absolutely savaged
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And I think there's a degree of that, there's a degree of pettiness and sort of moral righteousness that comes with journalism. So I think, sorry, I'm just sort of rambling on, but that's a sort of
No. No. It's very interesting.
I just think.
This would be an area that I'm sure you and Chris Morris would have a field day chatting about at dinner.
Mm,
I mean, he's so multi-talented. He's
mm,
not just a brilliant writer and performer, but he's also a great director,
mm,
and even like writes music and that kind of thing.
mm.
Um, is that? I mean, would you want to talk to him about his kind of wider career, or would you just be interested to have his kind of take on the state of satire and journalism kind of today?
Yeah, I think probably the latter more than. I mean, but it's just general peripheral conversations always interesting, particularly from someone like him. I mean, like his directing, like in Four Lions, was just. I thought Four Lions was so
Oh yeah,
brilliant. It's such a brilliant diffusion of terrorism. The fear that terrorism
yeah, yeah.
creates, and it's
It's
just brilliant.
terrific.
Um,
I saw a quote from him where he said that he'd hoped Four Lions would do for kind of radical Islamic terrorism what sort of Dad's Army aimed to do with the Nazis, which
mm,
was to acknowledge that they're awful and a threat, but also to kind of totally undermine and take the piss out of them
mm,
and like make them a little bit less scary.
mm,
And I
mm,
think
mm.
Four Lions was so effective in that regard.
I was, yeah. I mean, it's genius, and I just think I think he's just that. I think and I know that a lot of his stuff isn't always that well reviewed critically, but I don't care because I
Hmm.
think it's so good. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
and I often think sometimes when people don't get it, they miss the point of what he's trying to do. But I think he's
yeah.
just so talented, such an interesting individual. I'd love to get his opinions on satire at the moment and things in general like that. I've seen him do an interview where he says, I think this is a direct quote. He says the problem is we've got used to a kind of satire that effectively placates the court, in that you do a very nice dissection of how things are in the orthodox elite. And lo and behold, you get patted on the back by the Orthodox elite who say, "Jolly good, can you do us another?" And that's not what it's about. And I
Mm,
think
hmm.
there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of playing to the gallery in satire. Um, and I think the coolest, most interesting stuff is the stuff that challenges you out of beliefs that you already had. like Charlie Brooker would do in Black Mirror, you know. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I just
Yeah,
think that's
yeah.
so
That's a
interesting.
really interesting perspective. He's such a great guest, such a great choice of a guest, and I think he would really there'd be such interesting conversation between the four people that you've already chosen,
Mm.
and then to throw in one last fascinating and brilliant guest, someone who's maybe arguably your kind of best known impression,
Yeah.
and indeed you've performed your impression on stage alongside Rob Brydon and the man himself. You're inviting Andy Murray.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, such a big fan of Andy. I think he's really great. No, he's just I've just been such a fan. I mean, yeah. I just admire all these people. I've realised I'm very sexist for just choosing men, though. I've kicked myself before the podcast because I realised I hadn't said there are so many phenomenal, incredibly talented women. Catherine Ryan is tremendous. I think she's so
Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah.
Rani Edo
It's an
Lodge.
unfair brief to only allow 5 people, I will acknowledge
No,
that.
no, no. But I think Reni Edo Lodge, who's Reni Edo Lodge, whose book I read, the brilliant journalist Marina Hyde, phenomenal acerbic wit. So
Oh,
many
yeah.
fantastic women who my sexist conditioning has stopped me from inviting. Uh, Andy Murray, amazing. Yeah, it's such a. I just idolized him from such a young age because I love playing tennis like the posh disgrace I am, and he's just great. I mean, I think the problem is in the UK we don't like someone who'll do anything at all costs. We really care about grace and decorum a lot more than we care about the result very often. And because Andy Murray's
Yeah.
so doggedly determined, initially in his early career, I think people sort of like, oh, he's moany, blah blah blah. But the best thing now is that people have realised what a good bloke he is and how he's just the ultimate athlete. And I just I love the sport of tennis. I love him. I've for such a long time. He's such a nice guy when I met him. Really funny, got a good sense of humour. He always likes the Conservative Party advisor videos I do, which I find amusing.
Oh, great.
And he enjoys the "Hello, Joe. How are we?" I find that quite funny. And yeah, just generally a great bloke. Really, I watched his documentary. He's got a documentary on Amazon Prime called "Resurfacing" about his hip operation and coming back to tennis. And
Yeah, yeah.
he's just so driven, and it's so inspiring to see someone so obsessed with their craft and winning and being successful in a similar way to sort of Gordon Ramsay. So I kind of feel like him and Gordon Ramsay would get on very well, hopefully, and would talk. And
Yeah.
I think Andy Murray's quite a big fan of satire and is a big fan of Sacha Baron Cohen. So I think there'd be quite a good kind of general cohesion.
Oh, they're very good reasons to have him there. Yeah, I mean, you talk about his kind of his drive and that kind of thing, and obviously there was a point when it looked like he was going to retire,
Mm,
but we're speaking in a week where he's just scored a victory over someone
mm,
in the
mm.
top 10 for the first time in 3 years.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
you think there is one more big flourish yet to come in his career, or do you think it,
yeah.
it might just be a bit too physically demanding?
I really hope so, because I watched that match and he was moving incredibly well. I mean, for a 30, I mean, 33 is not old, but for a tennis player, for a tennis player it is, and he's
Yeah,
moving
yeah.
yeah, he's moving incredibly, he's so fast. So yeah, he looks good. He's clearly so dedicated and driven to play, which is wonderful. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to see him just keep playing and keep enjoying it because that's
Yeah.
you have to enjoy it. But
You
yeah.
talk about, and we've talked so much about satire,
Mm,
and by extension about politics and that kind of thing.
mm.
And you touched on the fact that he's a very progressive guy. He's very cool. He's a very
Yeah.
proud feminist and that kind of thing. Outside of his attitude to tennis and his
Mm,
ability in tennis and his craft and dedication to it, there's so much to like about him. He's got such a great sense of humor and everything.
mm, mm.
Uh, is that part of the reason? Stupid question, but is that part of
No,
the reason you're
no,
inviting
that's
him?
not a stupid question at all. I think, yeah, maybe this is just a sort of successful person thing, but I feel like they all have quite a similar sense of humor. They're all a bit mischievous. Chris Morris is mischievous. Sacha Baron Cohen is. Louis Theroux is. Gordon Ramsay is. They've all got a similar,
Yeah.
like, practical, jokey type way to them. And I think there's something in that that I find amusing. I like the craft of, because life if you sit and we can very easily become sad and think about the sad things in life, and with sometimes with a bit of practical joking and making an effort to see the funny. And I've definitely had times in lockdown where I felt quite low, and one of the big things I kind of said to myself was how important it is to just try and inject a bit of humor into your life, because kind of we spend a lot of time trying to come up with routines and stuff and to present to strangers.
Yeah.
But I don't know how there's so much fun and comedy that we can create in not an tiresome way either, in everyday life. And I think that's a
Mm.
really nice refreshing way to live your life, to like to sort of play jokes on people that you love and are close to you. And yeah, so I think there's
Yeah.
something I kind of like to learn maybe about that, because I can get quite sort of introspective and serious all of the time.
It's funny you say that because, and I totally agree, but that kind of serious and introspective, I guess, is something that a lot of people who maybe don't fully understand Andy Murray or don't know a lot about him, they might think he's like that.
Mm,
Like even your impression of him, it's obviously so full of fondness and affection for him,
mm.
but it does exaggerate that kind of quality in his voice
Yeah,
where he
yeah, yeah.
a lot of
Yeah,
the time
sorry.
sounds a bit bored.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
But I think he would be really fun at the dinner party. I think that is fair to say.
yeah, 100%. I mean, it's always that difference, isn't it? The disjoint between public perception and the person. And I think it's fantastically rare that the public perception of a human being has like that much relation to how they actually are, right? Like,
Mhm.
people we villainize in public discourse are probably very kind in some instances behind the scenes. People aren't always universally shit, and they aren't always universally good. But yeah, and just the point being, yeah, his public perception is, I would probably, yes, I think is quite inaccurate. But I think as an impressionist, you have to play off you have to play off public perception, don't you? You have to sort of
Yeah, yeah,
like
such a
I
balancing act for
yeah,
him.
yeah, yeah. Like, I think he's hilarious, fun, but if I came out and was like, "Oh, Andy Murray isn't he a joker?" and he's always cracking jokes, and well, actually, that is quite funny. Maybe that's funnier than what I currently do. I did
I
actually.
guess if
That was what I started doing. I just come out and be like, "Oh, this is Andy Murray as a comedian," in my incredibly comedically adept style. Of the first gig I ever did. Hey, look, no sort of lead in or intro gag or anything. And yeah, the problem is it didn't go down that well, because people have to sort of believe that you're the person, and then when you're not the person, when you don't look like the person, it kind of doesn't work. But anyway, sorry, comedic dead end.
No, no. He's such a fascinating guest, and I really like that kind of common thread that we've established through all of them. And I think you're so right. There's so much commonality between your five guests.
Mm.
It's shaping up to be such a great night. Sat by the Thames with Gordon Ramsay, Louis Theroux, Sacha Baron Cohen, Chris Morris, Andy Murray, yourself. The last thing we need to learn about is the menu.
Gosh,
Before we
yes,
talk about the food, are you an enthusiastic cook? You've talked about cooking some Gordon Ramsay
yeah,
recipes.
yeah. I've really been getting into it, actually. I've moved to a new place, and since that point, I've really been going for it, trying to cook some sort of nice fragrant salads and stuff like that to sort of stay lean. But I do, I love it. I love good food. I love pairing flavors. I find that really interesting. Like,
Oh yeah.
what goes with what. And I've got a lot to learn.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really enjoy it. I really enjoy assembling a meal. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Well, what would this fine group of people, what would they be getting treated to
Well,
at your
I've
dinner
said all
party?
that. I've really sold it. So I might just have a really shit. That might be a really shit. It's going to seem crap. Like we were saying earlier, I've set the bar so high that my mediocre menu will seem diabolical, like in comparison. I'll start with the pudding because I quite like. Well, I love a cheese board. My goodness, do I love a cheese board?
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
so that's got to be involved at some point. I don't know if this goes. Let's see.
Brilliant.
Like I said, I'm still refining my palate and learning what goes with what. But something quite light for a pudding, sort of a lemon tart or a sort of lemony cheesecake kind of thing.
Oh,
Like
lovely.
so,
Yeah.
like yeah, it's kind of fresh. That's what I would like, a sort of fresh menu. Um, so maybe like a sort of fish thing for the start for the main, like a sort of like
Mm.
a maybe a salmon or a bit of bass, and
Oh,
then
yes.
for the starter, that's the starter's tricky. The starter's kind of stumped me. Potentially a sort of a nice bruschetta. Like I'm going all over the place, Connor, with this. That's like Italian. You can't mix Italian with
Oh,
fish,
this
can
is.
you?
Oh, I think you could cook an Italian style fish.
Yeah.
Little
Okay.
oregano and some nice tomatoes, bit of lemon. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
with some pasta as well. That'd be pretty good.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Oh, this sounds like a great evening.
Yeah, and then
And as you said, the pressure's off with your menu because if
yeah,
Gordon
right.
Ramsay doesn't like it, he'll fire himself into the kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm hoping for throughout this. Maybe something with I love goat's cheese. Maybe something with a bit of goat's cheese for the start. Goat's cheese
Oh,
tart or
lovely.
something good. I don't think
Oh
that's a particularly
yeah.
cohesive menu. I have to be honest, uh, and I'm sure Gordon
These are a
Ramsay will
few
pick
maybe
me
of
up.
the greatest hits that you've cooked through lockdown, perhaps.
I just need the okay, big boy. Right, I'm going to rethink this menu. It's too complicated. It looks like shit. Get back in the kitchen. Okay. Service, yes, right. Wow, not good. Donkey. You should watch some of the early Kitchen Nightmares. They're really good because he's a bit less stylized in that. Like in the sort of noughties to the sort of tens, he realized that his thing was always abusing people, but like that became his brand. So he kind of like hammed it up
Yeah,
a
it
bit.
almost became pantomimical, yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like Jacob. Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg is a walking caricature, but like kind of like his poshness,
Yes.
like sort of leaned into it even more. Um, but in the early ones, he's so encouraging, and especially when he sees like a young chef who's like 18, it's just the little tips and stuff and the little energy and enthusiasm that he sort of breathes into them that is wonderful.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm gonna have to check that out. And if I can find the clip, I'll even post it in the episode description for this.
oh, good.
Josh, it's been such fun chatting to you about your dream dinner party. I really loved hearing about your guests. You mentioned that Josh Berry's Fake News is coming back in September.
Yeah. It's
That is very exciting on Union Jack.
yeah, thank you, mate. Yeah, it's fun. We got nommed for an award in the British Podcast Awards, which is good. This new series is a little bit different. It's historically it was just sort of like a silly sketch show. This is a bit more a piss take of public figures and media discourse in kind of an equal measure, right?
Oh,
If Spitting Image is just about public figures and the day to day was just about media discourse, this is trying to straddle that divide and say something interesting about both.
that sounds really exciting.
Oh, thank you, man. We'll see. We'll see how successful it is. It probably won't be.
Well, we will post links to it in the episode description as well. And also we will I mean you put out such great stuff on Instagram and on
Oh,
Twitter
thanks,
and
man.
yeah, so we'll post stuff to your social media as well. Josh, it's always such fun talking to you. Thank you so much for joining
Likewise,
me
Connor. It's
on the
always
podcast.
such a. I feel that you're a very grounding presence. I feel very calm
Oh,
around you, and I think that's a great thing.
you're far too kind, and I'm sure my wife would disagree with that massively, but I'll take the compliments where I can get them, Josh. Thank you, buddy. I'll hopefully speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cheers. Well, there we go. That was Josh Berry's dream dinner party. I really enjoyed that. Do make sure you check out Josh's work. He's got the new series of Josh Berry's Fake News coming out in September, and he's always putting out top quality content in his social media pages. Links to those are in the episode description. I am absolutely loving making this podcast. It's such a treat for me to speak to such brilliant people like Josh and get to hear more about the people and personalities that have inspired them. If you're enjoying the podcast anywhere near as much as I am, please do like, subscribe, rate, share, etc. It would be so kind of you to help us out by spreading the word, because without listeners, this is just two people having a stimulating conversation. And who on earth does that benefit? If you want to hear any more from me, you can check out the Jericho Comedy Podcast, which is released every Monday, or you can visit www.connormcreynolds.com for more of my radio, podcast, writing, and comedy work. I'll be back next week with another fantastic guest chatting all about their dream dinner party. But until then, thanks so much for listening, and bye-bye.